Hi friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. You join us together as we're working through the Gospel of Luke. It amazes me, every time I approach the Bible, how relevant it is to our everyday lives, how meaningful it is to the issues and the challenges we face today. And it's no different today, friends. Today's passage, just a few verses from Luke 12:13 to 22, deals with the issue of greed. I do hope you enjoy the time together. I do hope you get some insights, some help in having the right attitude to how you live your life. So it's great to have you here. If you're here for the first time, why not subscribe and make the decision to make the study of the Bible part of your everyday pattern of living? And I'll see you at the end to tell you how you can connect and get free additional Bible teaching and Bible study resources. Bye-bye for now. Okay, we're off again today. Luke chapter 12:13 to 22, picking up exactly where we left off yesterday. And I suppose I'd like to begin by asking a question, as I often do, and that is, what characterizes the days in which we are living? It doesn't take much to think about. There are certain issues and problems that are at the forefront of the world. Maybe it's war, maybe it's the fact that there seems to be immorality all around us. Casual attitudes to sex, casual attitudes to commitment, stealing, lying, dishonesty. Well, dishonesty even seems to be permeating to the various highest levels in society in the world today. However, what I'd like to do today is make a suggestion about something that Jesus points out here, something that he says we really specifically need to be aware of. And I'm sure it's not one of the first things that popped into your head, but I believe it characterizes most of the countries in which we live today, and to some extent even our modern churches. So with that in mind, let me begin by reading to you our passage today, and then we'll work through it verse by verse as is our pattern. So Luke chapter 12, beginning at verse 13, says this. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide his inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to him, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." Then he told him this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. There I will store my surplus grain. And I shall say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God." Okay, people, the structure of this passage is fairly straightforward. It begins with this guy out of the crowd asking the Lord to compel his brother to divide his inheritance with him. And the Lord gives this reply, which is rather curt, but after giving this rather straightforward, in-your-face reply, he then expands on it by telling this young man a parable. So let's begin with this man. Now, I called him young because I'm assuming he's quite young, because he comes to him and says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So he's obviously young enough that he is receiving inheritance from a father, the previous generation, who's died. Now, that sort of problem, the problem he's coming with to Jesus, is usually something that would be covered under the Mosaic law and its principles. And beyond that, it was the rabbis in the temple who were appointed to decide about how these laws should be applied, and in the case of disputes, how they should be dealt with. Now, perhaps this fellow came to Christ because he himself was a teacher or a rabbi. So what's going on here bears a little probing and a little explanation as to what's really going on. But we don't know anything other from the text itself than what is said for us here. But what we do know beyond this limited amount of information is this, that in those days in Israel, the older brother got a double portion of the inheritance. So we can assume this fellow is the younger of brothers, or the youngest brother in that family. That's very likely the case. We can't be absolutely sure, but that seems to be the most logical conclusion here. At any rate, this older brother would have got at least a double inheritance because, and this is important, it was his responsibility to meet the needs of both widowed mother and any unmarried sisters that were left. So he would get a double portion that would enable him to take care of those members of the wider family. So perhaps that's what's happened here. And here is the other brother saying, well, he got a lot more than me. And he's saying, ask him to divide the inheritance with me. Now, of course, it is entirely possible that there wasn't any division at all and he hadn't been left anything. So although we can take different interpretations to this, this much is clear. This guy is not satisfied with whatever he got, whatever importance of the inheritance he got. Either he got none at all or he got less than the other brother. It is possible, as some have said, maybe he got an inheritance, but he had already spent it at this point. At any rate, on this day, he arrives in front of Jesus and he's not satisfied with his lot in life. Now, the other observation that we can make, which is very important, regardless of what he got, he wanted more. This is the bottom line of what's going on here. The question he says of Jesus, the demand he makes of him is to tell my brother to divide his inheritance with me, meaning I want some of what he got. Now, whether he got half or he got nothing or his brother got a double portion, in a sense, all of that is immaterial because the real issue that's underlying this, as far as this guy who's appeared before Jesus is that he wanted more than he got. It's also important to understand what happens next. Jesus says to him, "Man, who made me a judge and arbiter over you?" Now, the word that he addresses him with, man, is frankly a rather curt, severe way of addressing this young man in this situation. And he follows it up with a straightforward clarification. Look, I'm not your judge and I'm not your arbiter. Now, the difference between these two things at that time was the judge is the one who interpreted the law and the arbiter is the one who saw that it was carried out. Such people are appointed today in wills to make sure the estate is divided as mentioned in the will. At any rate, Jesus says here, look, I'm not this judge. I'm not your arbiter in this situation. At any rate, that's what Jesus is saying. I'm not your judge. I'm not your arbiter in this situation. What he has come is he's come to be a teacher, to be a savior, to be an example. And what he begins to do here is express that fact. And he begins to do that in verse 15 when it says, then he said to them. So immediately the question in our mind should be, who's he speaking to now? Who's the them in question? Well, I'm going to suggest, as many others believes, based on the fact that the term them is used, that prior to this point he's been speaking to the man. In fact, he addresses that one single man and talks to him. And then in the next verse it says, so he says to them. So verse 15 is meant to tell us that he's now speaking to the wider crowd, the people who've witnessed this conversation. So one person in the crowd asked this question about their lot in life and how they weren't satisfied with the inheritance. And Jesus uses this opportunity as a time to teach the whole crowd a principle of the kingdom. And he says this, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist of an abundance of possessions. So Jesus turns to the crowd and says, the real problem here, the real lesson to be learned here has to do with greed, covetousness. Beware, there's a danger in thinking the way this guy's thinking. And then he explains, because life doesn't consist or is valued, in fact, by the amount of the things that a person possesses. So the greedy, covetous person is apparently the one who thinks the meaning of life and happiness in life comes by way of the amount of money or the amount of stuff that we possess. So Jesus is not so much concerned about the inheritance between these two brothers, but what is concerning him is the attitude of this younger brother towards the material things in life. And this is the opportunity he's going to use as a teaching moment. The guy is of the opinion that life for him, the important stuff in life, is about the amount of money and possessions you have. Mark Twain defined civilizations in this humorous and insightful way. He said it's just a limited multiplication of unnecessary things. That was true in the time of Mark Twain. It's certainly true of the time of Jesus, and it's absolutely true of the times in which we live today. Many people just seem to want and to say, I want more, I need more, I must have more. And the problem is that Jesus is drawing attention to is that attitude will never lead to satisfaction in life. Another proverb I read said money is like seawater. The more a person drinks, the thirstier they become until it even kills them. Being that as is may, Jesus is saying here, this guy's got an attitude problem, and we need to be aware of thinking that way, because he wants to impress on us that life doesn't consist of amassing a great amount of stuff, materialism, money, or even just things. People, it seems, have an almost unquestionable thirst for getting more and more of whatever it is they want in life, more money, more stuff, in order many people believe, because they believe that is what will give them satisfaction in life. It may be a thirst for straightforward money or for the things that money can buy, but sometimes it can even be an unhealthy thirst for position and power. And I would submit to you that this idea, this type of greed, is one of the big characteristics of the present age in which we live. People are so inclined these days to think, if I can only get a little bit more, I'll be a better person and I'll be happier in my life. Some people, good people, spend an enormous amount of time imagining what they'd do if they win the lottery. They think, I'd be happier. This type of thinking has so permeated our society and culture, this form of materialism, call it consumerism if you like, this attitude of wanting more and more stuff and thinking, this is the key point, thinking that somehow the acquisition of that stuff is the thing that is necessary for a happy and a satisfied life. We only have to watch the adverts between TV programs, don't we? The commercials, their sole perspective seems to be to convey the idea that if you just have this thing, then you will be happier. If you just have this product, you'll be more satisfied in life. Other people will envy you, and you will be a happy person, a content person. This is exactly the attitude that Jesus is addressing and talking about here. He's saying beware of that, because it's just greed. Thinking if you're going to have more, or that more stuff will make you happy or satisfied, that in fact is nothing else but greed. And in order to drive this home and make sure nobody in the crowd misses this fact, Jesus begins to tell a parable, a story to illustrate the point, the truth he's trying to get over. Now note, the man in our parable, in the story that he uses, is already rich. He's got plenty. He's a successful farmer. His fields are yielding successful crops. You might even say he's probably a hard-working guy. No doubt he's had the good fortune of having fertile lands and good fields. But the point is, he's already rich and he's going to get more. He's going to get even richer. So he thinks to himself, what am I going to do? I have no room to store all these amazing crops that are being yielded from my field. I have a problem. He's got more and more, so much more coming in that he doesn't know where to put it. Already he's rich. That's what the idea of barns being already full, a perfect illustration for that agricultural society at that time. And his problem is he's got no place to put the bumper crop that's coming now. So he thinks to himself, and he comes up with this idea, this plan. He'll tear down his old barns and he'll build even bigger ones, a place to store his crops and his goods, And then he says, if I do that, if I only do that, I'll then be able to set enough aside for many years and I can take care of myself. I can take it easy, as they say. I can just eat, drink, and be merry. Now notice he's going to pull down his barns, plural, barns S. He's already got buildings that are full, multiple buildings, but he's going to tear those down and build even bigger ones. And that's his plan. Notice the element of selfishness that is the heart of this passage. He has no room to store any crops. He's not planning to give them away or spread them amongst other people or the community in which he lives. He's going to pull down his barns and build even bigger ones. The end results of which he thinks if he does that, he will then be able to take it easy, to eat, drink, and be merry. Almost every word coming out of this guy's mouth has to do with selfishness. It's all about him. It's about him being a self-centered person. He only thinks about himself. He's not thinking about others. There's no thought of using money to the glory of God or to help others. He just thinks of it as his own and his own plunder, his own pleasure, and he's not concerned about anybody else. He's only concerned with maintaining his level of ownership and overindulgence. He's laid up treasure for himself before, believing that now he believes he'll just have to establish a plan where he'll be able to lay up even more of these material possessions, shall we say, and he believes that in doing that will provide him all he needs to be happy and to have peace in life. So Jesus uses this story to teach the opposite of that life does not consist of an abundance of things, of any things that a person might possess. And then he tells the story of this man. Remember, he's already rich, and he believes, that's the key point, he believes that by getting even more, that will make him even happier. But then we see God's response to this man's plan and perspective. It says God calls him a fool. And he says, this night your soul will be required of you. Then who will get this stuff you have hoarded for yourself? Now, what I think is interesting is the fact that probably whilst Jesus was telling this very story, I would imagine that the majority of people in the crowd would initially have been envious of the guy in the story. They would have envied his full barns, the fact that he had bumper cropped, and the fact that he had so much he couldn't even store it. And the fact that he's going to actually knock down his old barns and build up larger ones, build bigger and better ones. So they look at this person and they see that he was rich, and they see that he said by doing this that he would gain happiness. But Jesus breaks into this perspective and says, wait a minute, God says this guy is a fool. But here's what he said, you're a fool because this night your life is required of you. He's a fool because this is not talking about the judgment of God falling on this man because of his behavior. It's drawing attention to the fact that he's being foolish because he has no anticipation of the fact that he might die one day. Perhaps he might die that very night, the very night that this silly plan was hatched. So God says, because of his response to the blessings in his life, that he's going to do it in this way. God's response is, you're just a fool. All those material possession, God says. Well, God asks the question, if this night your soul is required of you, then who will get those things that you have been provided with, all this blessing that you have? In the final analysis, you see he's saying this man was rich in the things of the world, what was poor in spirit. He really, in the end, didn't even have his life because he was materially rich on the surface, yes, but spiritually underneath he was bankrupt. Someone I read suggested that he was a fool because he tried to satisfy himself with things to the point of deceiving himself into thinking he owned the things he possessed. That's the key here. And because of that, because he was trying to deal with that side of it, he was not making any adequate provision for eternity. So God, in effect, asks him, by nature, Jesus uses it to ask the crowd, and to us still reading this today, what happens to our possessions when we die? The rich farmer had lived his life without thinking of others, As I demonstrated a moment ago, he only thought about himself, and he only thought about his accumulated wealth as being for himself. But in the end, all of his possessions would be given through inheritance to others. The one very thing he never thought about while he was alive. He probably, in modern terms, didn't even have what we would call a will. And he did not take any. One thing we can be sure of, as is 100% of everyone who's walked this planet, he didn't take anything with him when he died. There's an old Spanish proverb that says there are no pockets in a burial shroud. Like everyone else who has walked this earth, he will take nothing with him when he dies. Anything he has, at best, will be left to someone else. It might even, if a will is not made, it might even just be left to the state. And isn't that what happens to everybody and to all material things that we have? Everything we own either wears out before we die or, upon death, belongs to someone else after we die. So the parable is really meant to remind us of the truth of the fact that God, ultimately, in the fullness of time, is in fact really the owner of all things, and we merely have use of them, stewardship of them, for a while we're alive on this earth. The man in this story thought that those very material things could make him happy, but Jesus just ends up saying to him, he who lays up treasure for himself is not rich. The other side of that coin is, in fact, we should be laying up treasure in heaven. So the Lord points out here throughout this passage in this parable that this guy thought only about himself. He doesn't by nature think of other people. And Jesus gets to the bottom of the issue by saying he was only rich temporarily in these material things, but he was never rich towards God and rich in the spiritual realm. Those who live for material possessions, who spend solely on their own pleasure, may on the surface appear for a transient period of time to be rich in terms of the world, but for the most part they're poor in their relationship with God. But what does it mean to be rich before God? Well, for the one thing, it means having a close, living, vibrant relationship with him and faithfully serving him. It's about living a life of spiritual enrichment, not using the stuff of life for your own personal enjoyment. That is really the issue that's being presented here. This man had full barns, but he did not have faith. He had wealth, but he did not have love. He had possessions, but he had no joy in their accumulation or in their use. He had an abundance of things, but he didn't have a relationship with God. And this is serious. And let me tell you how serious this is. In Colossians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul makes this statement for us to try and help us really understand how serious this is. And frankly, it's a little shocking. He says this, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is all idolatry." So noticed amongst this list of grievous sins and activities, immoral activities that people might engage in, he lists the theme of greed and covetousness. I think that's really interesting. He defines them all, those things, as all being idolatry, which of course takes us back to the opening original statement in verse 15, where Jesus addressed people first by saying, beware of greed. That is, that thinking life is an abundance of things, because if you approach life that way, you're guilty of idolatry. Idolatry is putting possessions in place of God and faith. So no wonder Jesus says beware here. Okay, that's the passage. Let me just try and sum it up for you. The sum is very simple. I suppose we could just say Jesus says beware of greed, but beware that thinking that abundance of things in the sense that the process of accumulating stuff will make you happy, instead of realizing that what brings satisfaction with life is a relationship with God. Now, it would be easy to read this passage and think that the Lord is in fact condemning people from being rich or for possessing a lot of worldly goods. But that is not what's going on here. That is not true. The Lord is not condemning here the principle of being wealthy. Paul actually for us addresses this absolute issue specifically for us in 1 Timothy chapter 6, when he says, "Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, not to trust in uncertain things, but trust in the living God, who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Let them do good that they may be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for a time to come, that they may lay hold of eternal life." So notice Paul is addressing the people that he's writing to, the people living, as he calls it, in this present age. In 1 Timothy chapter 6:17, he's talking to and about people who themselves are materially wealthy. And he's saying this, "Command those of you who are rich amongst you in the world that we're living," in other words, this group who we're part of today, just remind them not to be arrogant in their wealth and not to put their hope in the wealth. That's so uncertain. That doesn't last. Remind them, keep reminding them to keep their hope and faith in God. In fact, he goes on to say, do not trust in uncertain riches, but instead trust in the living God. And then he says, and if you're wealthy, enjoy it and give richly to all others that they might enjoy it as well. So in principle, it's important to understand that Christ is not condemning the idea of the fact that some people are wealthy. In fact, in the Old Testament, by the standards of the day, Abraham was wealthy. Solomon was super wealthy. And in the New Testament, we know that Barnabas was wealthy. That's not the problem here. The problem is that you're arrogant, you're haughty, and that you're trusting and getting your security from the stuff you own instead of the living God. So he's saying, if you've been blessed, if you're wealthy, then enjoy it. Just make sure you trust the Lord. And he said, by the way, do good works. If you're rich, be willing to share it. Don't be selfish. Give some of it away. And by doing so, you're actually storing up for yourself this idea of treasure in heaven. So I want to clarify, friends, the Lord is not condemning the possession of worldly goods. There's nothing wrong with being rich. The point here is that the Lord is condemning the attitude. The issue is not about the amount of money you have, it's the attitude you have towards it. Rich people can be covetousness, but in truth, some poor people can have a bad attitude of wanting more in the sense of thinking that just having more of that stuff will make them happy. So may I repeat, what the Lord is condemning here is greed and covetousness. He's not condemning the fact that some people in life will experience a degree of greater wealth than others. And the key issue here is thinking that if you achieve greater wealth, that is the thing that will make you happy or even bring you security. That's what's wrong here. And Jesus' plan here is to use this opportunity through this story, this parable, to show the folly of materialism, making that the center of your life in the light of the brevity and the uncertainty of the life in which we live. Life is not worth living if you base it on owning material things, because by nature that means you're going to be ignoring God. No one can enjoy happiness, security, rest in their soul, or even find peace or true meaning in this life if their focus is on these material possessions. As it was simply said by Jesus, man cannot live by bread alone. This is what Jesus is condemning, thinking that stuff will make you happy or contented. So the warning here is God doesn't condemn wealth, but he's saying, look, friends, there is real peril to being prosperous. Wealth can choke out the word of God. It can create a trap for you to fall into, and it does that by creating a false sense of security. So the Lord is condemning any attitude of greed, thinking that if I just had more, I could be satisfied and safe from this. And that's the risk, that's the peril, that's the trap. The point here is life, as ever, as always, should really be focused on our relationship with God and our relationship to other people. So in conclusion, friends, let me just say Jesus asks us through this parable, through this teaching, to always remember, to never forget that life does not consist, and meaning in life is not based around the abundance of things that you might happen to possess. Life consists of being good and living a life that's rich, but rich in your relationship with Him. I'll leave it there now. Hi friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. You join us today as we continue our journey through the Gospel of Luke. I've entitled today's talk, based on the insights that Jesus gives in this passage, Beware of Worry. I feel I need at the very beginning to put a bit of a caveat in on everything I'm going to say and that follows on here. What I'm talking about and dealing with here is the normal worries, sometimes become an attitude of chronic worry, that people experience in life. Sometimes people use the word anxiety to describe such a state. But I need to put a very clear caveat in about anybody who may be listening to this who is struggling with a situation where they've been diagnosed with a clinical form of anxiety, or perhaps someone who has bipolar affective disorder and has an anxiety that arises out of that in the depressive stage, anxiety, worry, or even depression, or in fact any anxiety from this type or any other type of chronic long-term mental health condition. What we're dealing here is with the standard type of worry where people take real things, maybe blow them up a little bit out of perspective and dwell on them unhealthily. My understanding of anxiety and worry when connected to the depressive phase or a chronic mental health condition, it is actually the core of those worries. Yes, they may be triggered by real events, but they're usually linked to false thoughts, things that aren't true, maybe even a psychosis which causes the person to believe and worry about things that are in fact exaggerated to the point where they're detached from the reality of the situation they're based in. That type of worry, that type of anxiety is not what I'm talking about in today's passage. For that type of anxiety, you should continue to try and get the help and the advice that you need from clinicians, whilst at the same time availing yourself of a supportive Christian community who can help carry you through that stage of this illness. With that said, thanks for joining me. I hope you find today's episodes really helpful in how to deal with worry and how to be aware of just how dangerous and toxic worry can become in the life of everyone. Thanks for being with me today. Hi friends, welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Today we're covering Luke chapter 12, verses 22 to 34. And before we begin our study of this passage, which I've given the title, Beware of Worry, I'd like to state the fact that in reality, everybody, all of us worry about things sometimes. Some people live in a state of sort of a low level of constant sort of anxiety or worry. They raise it almost to an art form in their lives. They worry about lots of things all of the time. But if that's the reality of our human experience, then how should we handle it? Well, I'm thrilled to be able to tell you that we're able to approach the best expert that there's ever been when it comes to dealing with issues like that. And I'm sure, well, are you interested if I was to tell you that Jesus gives us some wonderful tools and insights in how to handle this aspect of life? We've got to remember that if Jesus is indeed God in human form, then we can also understand that he is the one who knows us, created us, put us together, actually, knows every head in our head. So I think it's really useful, important and helpful if I share with you what Jesus taught about worry, and more importantly, how we should deal with it, how we should handle it. And I'll do that. First of all, I'll begin by reading the verses we're going to cover today, which is a fairly lengthy passage, and then we'll go through it together, section by section. So, it begins Luke chapter 12, verse 22, and it says this: Then Jesus said to his disciples, Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear, for life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than these birds. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wildflowers grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today, and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. For the pagans who run the world after all such things, and the Father knows exactly what you need. But seek first his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you his kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourself that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth can destroy. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Okay, there's a lot in this passage, but the structure of it is relatively straightforward. The first thing he does is he introduces by saying simply do not worry, and after that he establishes, I would say, a way to approach life, how to manage worry, so I think it's worth looking at this again. So let's begin with the opening section. Now, before we even get into it, we see in verse 22 that he's speaking to his disciples. So please note, this is important, friends. This is initially addressed to believers. He's not saying this to unbelievers, as becomes more and more evident as the passage progresses. He's talking to people who have recognized him as their Lord. Then looking at verse 22, he begins by saying, therefore. Now, I've said before, any time in the Bible where you see the word therefore at the beginning of a passage, you need to ask, what is it there for? Well, in this case, it's a conclusion based, he's going to offer now a conclusion based at what he's just taught. And do you remember what he's just talked about? Well, I know it's what we looked at yesterday, but the basic idea yesterday was about not coveting, not being greedy. So therefore, he says, because of having had that discussion about that, he says you should not worry either. Now, in the latter part of the passage yesterday, he actually told people to lay up their treasure in heaven, lay up the things that are rich towards God, not to covet the things of this world, but to desire the things that are riches in the kingdom of God, and lay up those things, an investment, if you like, in your spiritual life. And if you're doing that, then you're in a position where he's saying you don't need to worry about these other things. And this passage here is meant to emphasize the importance of now having made the decision to not to worry, not to be greedy, not to covet. He's emphasizing the importance of now, there's no logic to worrying about the material things in life anymore, such as food and clothing. Instead, we should be in a position of trusting in God's provision for all those worldly things in our life. So as Jesus is guiding his followers away from a preoccupation with possessions and the anxieties associated with living that way. Isn't this very different to how the gospel is presented by some on the fringes of the church today? So let's break down what he says into the key points and the two things that I think he suggests that we use as strategies to address any potential problem of worry or anxiety in our life. He's telling us right from the get-go that life is not really about material possessions. He recognizes that a lot of worry in people's lives is about, in a sense, getting stuff, but it's about the fear of losing the material possessions, the material securities that they already have. And Jesus is highlighting the significance of life being something that is way beyond just our physical needs. He's contrasting the value of life, the real meaning of life, with the pursuit of pursuing those things, which in essence boil down to nothing more than chasing after food, clothing, and material possessions, emphasizing that our existence, our very existence, and our view of ourselves and God's view of us is not defined in any way by anything we possess. And he uses this wonderful picture when he says, consider the ravens in verse 24. So he uses the examples of birds. But ravens were a type of bird which, as it tells us, didn't sow, didn't store up food, yet like all birds, God provides for them. And then he says to his followers, don't you realize that you're more valuable than these birds, which God provides for them everything he need? And this encourages believers, of course. It encourages us to just simply try and get our lives into a position where we just trust in God's care for us. And the fact that that is underpinned by God knowing our inherent value and what we are to him. Now, I believe this passage is deliberately placed juxtaposed with the previous one which we looked at yesterday. Because look at what he says. He's talking about birds. He's talking about sowing and reaping. He's also, yesterday we heard about this guy who was thinking so much about tomorrow that he was planning new barns and storehouses. All of this is meant to remind us back because it's coming out of this same sort of agricultural metaphor picture that he's using, the one that we looked at last time in the parable he used. The one who was already rich, this guy yesterday who already had a bumper crop, was trying to figure out a way of dealing with, well, what should have been a wonderful problem of having too much of an abundant crop, thinking I'm going to have to tear down my existing storehouses and build even bigger barns. So this teaching today is connected to that which we did yesterday. And I'm certain of that because, as I said, the opening passage of today's passage was the word therefore. So today is what we're meant to extrapolate out of it. Today is the benefit that we're meant to get out of applying what we learned yesterday, in the sense that we don't need to worry if we follow this strategy. So Jesus is essentially saying, don't worry about those things. But, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't sow. Should you still plan for the future? Yes. Should you sow? Yes. Should you reap? Yes, absolutely. Should you have a barn? Well, yes, you should. You should have a plan, a strategy, a place to store up and create a level of security for yourself and your loved ones. Of course, we need to go to the supermarket. Of course, we need to buy groceries. Should we have clothes in our wardrobe? Of course. But what Jesus is really saying, he's saying, yes, you can do that stuff, but you mustn't worry about that stuff. And you don't worry about that stuff by making it important in your life. More importantly, by making it the focus of your life. It's saying that you can get on with serving the kingdom of God in the knowledge that God's actually going to take care of all that other stuff you used to worry about. Now, his illustration of the ravens, I think it's worth just unpacking that a little bit more, because this is very similar to something that he taught on the Sermon on the Mount as recorded in Matthew. You may recall in the Gospel of Matthew, he also talked about birds, but that time he didn't use ravens as an illustration. He specifically talked about sparrows. So why ravens this time? Well, I think I can help and clarify the difference. You see, sparrows were birds that had little value. They were of a low value, but they had a value. But according to the Mosaic law, ravens were considered of no value. In fact, beyond that, they were considered unclean birds, and the least respected of all birds at that time. They had no sacrificial value whatsoever in terms of the sacrifices that could be offered. So he's saying, look, God not only feeds the birds, we've talked about that in the past, he's saying God even feeds the ravens, the type of birds that have no values, the type of birds that contribute nothing. They don't even choose to live anywhere. They're scavengers. They don't set up nests in barns. Yet still, God chooses to feed them and provide them what they need in a daily manner. So they're not in any way a valuable birds, yet God cares for them. So this is how we are to understand and handle such things such as worry and anxiety. We've got to remember that God takes care of everything, and he uses this exaggerated limit, if you like, setting no limit, rather, to the value that God places in terms of his creation by caring for everything. So to be rich in God, we've got to remember that God feeds the birds, and he even feeds the bird brains like you and I. Then he raised this other thought. Which of you by worrying can add an inch, a cubit actually, he says, to your stature? Now, a cubit was a measurement from the tip of the fingers to the elbow, usually considered to be about 18 inches. Some say it was a little bit longer. But the key point is clear. If I was to challenge you today to focus on trying to increase your height by just thinking on it, focusing on it, and you to do that for 7 days, for a week, 24 hours a day, and if you came back and measured yourself again, how much height do you think you will have added? Well, clearly, you're not able to do anything about that. And this is a very useful metaphor to describe what worry's like. He's literally saying worry is useless. It's as useless as trying to increase your height. That's the point Jesus is making. Worrying is literally a waste of time. Imagine the amount of time you've spent in your life thinking, pondering, worrying, having anxiety about something in the future, and it doesn't come to pass, or it doesn't come to pass in the way that you were worrying about. What a perfect definition of a waste of time. It's almost like you might have well spent 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, trying to make yourself taller. In other words, it's a dramatic picture presented about just how ineffective and useless worrying is. So he uses this illustration about the ravens and the second one about the flowers. And then this idea is wrapped together with all his teaching about, please, my children, stop worrying about the basic everyday essentials like food and clothing. Just focus on the kingdom coming. Now, at the end of yesterday's passage, Jesus concluded by urging us not to lay up treasure for ourselves on earth, but rather focus on laying up treasure in heaven. In other words, the switch comes from being rich towards God rather than trying to build up riches in this world. And being rich towards God really only involves having faith. James also in his letter, New Testament letter, speaks about those people who are rich in faith. So you see, if you are rich towards God, the way to be rich towards God, rather, it all comes down to living the life of faith, in trusting God's provision. And by being rich in faith, then you trust in God's provision, and you know and trust in God will give you what you need day to day, and will also carry you through the problems, the issues that you will face day to day. So to sum this all up, Jesus instructs us not to have anxiety about any of the things of this world. Of course, starting with the basic illustration of not worrying about what we should eat or drink, but he's going way beyond that. He's saying that we should not worry about anything. We should simply live in the knowledge and the faith that God plans to provide us with everything we need, even what we need to get through with the difficult things in life. And that is how we're able to deal with an anxious mind, to deal with the problems of worry and anxiety. In other words, it's an illogical waste of time doing about those things. It's not logical to do this and have anxieties if you truly are trusting in God and believing in the character of God and how much He cares for you. Now, the Greek phrase translated anxious mind in this passage, it's intriguing because it's a word rather that's used to describe a ship caught in a storm. It refers to being tossed all over the place. So both in James and both here, the term anxious mind is used to refer to this idea of having a personality where you're a bit like a ship cast adrift in a storm. In fact, in James 1:6, he is comparing the waves of the sea having the effect of driving and tossing that person towards danger because of the sort of instability in the life of this way of thinking. So the advice here by Jesus is don't let this whirlwind of thoughts toss your life like a ship in a storm. So there's a crucial difference, a crucial distinction in how we should approach life here. Now, it's never one that says you should give up thoughts of working towards material things, having a life where you plan and you purpose to live out in a way where you can provide for yourself and provide security to other people you have responsibility for and you love, but rather that you should approach these issues, these factors in life, without having any anxiety about it. It's about living a life in positive terms. The emphasis is about not making the security or the seeking of the material things become the center of your life, becoming the passion in your life as it is for some people. That's the background of how he's saying, yeah, you live in the real world, you have to do these things, but you should not have concern about these things. And Jesus deals with it by saying, the important thing is to direct your focus, if you like, to serving God, to loving God, to building his kingdom on earth. It's more about focusing your direction and taking care of the things that concern God, his kingdom, his righteousness, expressing his love and mercy to other people. And by making that the first thing in your life, then that pushes the other things into the background. It makes those material needs, yes, you can say, that's taken care of. I don't have to worry about anything associated with that aspect of its life. So Jesus is encouraging his disciples, as it says here, do not fear. Do not live a life of worry. Do not live a life of anxiety. Now, the climax of this section is in the final verses, where it tells us that, in fact, not only do we not need to worry about these things, but we need to understand that it is God's desire, God's pleasure to provide for us and give us our basic needs. And trusting in the Lord, seeking his kingdom first, will result in God expressing those blessings to us. The contrast here for us is stark. For those who worry, they lack trust, they live a life whereby they fail to seek the kingdom of God, and there is a sense that means they're not able to enjoy the blessing of living a life in peace and having a sense of security. And there's an insight here that it will also mean that we're not going to be blessed with the rewards in life that God would want to and plans to give us. Now, towards the end of this passage, there seems to be a rather strong suggestion that we should sell what we have and give it to charity. In fact, it's fairly clear. It says, if you're struggling with this, maybe you should divest yourself of possessions, extend charity, and thereby accumulate heavenly treasures. Now, this approach sounds radical, doesn't it? But let me say, what Jesus is actually addressing here is the tendency in his age, and especially in this age today, is for people to have an attitude where they hoard they cling on to those possessions, and at the same time, usually, ironically, that goes hand in hand with worry. It's about trying to control, isn't it? That's what psychologists would tell us. However, let's be clear, this passage about giving away is not teaching about us as Christian believers neglecting any sort of sense of financial wisdom. I believe that as we're meant to have a budget, we're meant to be wise stewards of our resources. That's not being condemned by Jesus here. Jesus isn't advocating that we wander around with an empty purse or an empty wallet, with no clothes on our back, no advanced financial planning in place. The key message here is for people who are worrying. It is, you might say, if you tie it into the illustration of the guy with the barns, the storehouses before, it's actually giving the cure-all here for people who are inclined to hoard, especially when it's motivated by anxiety, fear, or self-centeredness. It's very reminiscent of the foolish farmer in the parable, which we've just looked at yesterday, and he's tying this teaching in as a response and outworking of. If you consider the fear associated with worrying, it's usually around about not having enough in the future, an imagined future where you won't have enough. Well, Jesus says, if you're stuck in that place, you're stuck in that psychological place, there is one dramatic remedy for that fear. You see, often fear of being poor in the future is the thing that hinders us from generously supporting others today, by generously living the kingdom life in this day, by encouraging others, by giving and alleviating their needs. So Jesus is challenging us here. If you're in the grip of a fear of poverty, which is not based in a reality, he suggests that the way out of that is to be more generous in your life, to give it and to help other people, and that way you are in fact storing up treasure in heaven. So this final verse at the end of this passage exposes the connection between the treasures of the heart and the fact that we are called on certain occasions when we haven't got the balance right to respond to that wrong way of living by simply giving generously of that which we have hoarded and stored up, so that in a sense we're translating it from that worldly place into a treasure in heaven. Now, sometimes the conventional understanding of this verse is actually reversed, incorrectly, I believe. Many would take this verse and try to preach that if you're right before God, he will give you, he will bless you. However, I believe what Jesus is presenting here is saying, no, what you're meant to do is give first and your heart will follow, and that you will be rich in the blessings of God and that you're storing up treasure in heaven. So, here's the ironically, a counterintuitive teaching of Jesus. When you are specifically worried or fearful about material needs, financial needs, Jesus provides a solution to trust God, to seek his kingdom, and yes, to be generous with other people. Not to the point of foolishness, not to the point of neglecting your financial responsibilities, but if your inclination is to hoard and to worry about the future by putting more and more aside, then the response to that is to switch it, to make a decision to use those resources to meet the needs of others, to bless other people. And then your heart, of course, is more aligned with God's heart for other people. And then you are actually, in effect, storing up heavenly treasures. So the formula of this passage is clear. The pattern of this passage is clear, is a better way of describing it. Don't worry, trust God, seek his kingdom, and always, friends, be generous. Give generously, because your heart is where you place your treasure. Is your focus on earth, on earthly things, or on heaven? So that's the deal. And if that's the case, and that's the insights, so why are we worrying? Well, let me close by saying two things. Number one, do not worry. Worry is wrong. Anxiety is wrong. I understand the caveats of clinical depression, clinical anxiety, but in the normal course of things, worry is unnecessary. It serves no purpose. It does nothing for it. It doesn't change the situation. It is literally useless, a waste of time. Sadly, some of us worry about everything all the time. But this passage, I know it sounds simple. God is saying, if you're a believer, if you've trusted in him, then you absolutely have nothing to worry about. The eternal has been taken care of. And number two, I wonder if you can guess what I'm going to say. Simply, friends, firstly, don't worry. And secondly, trust in God. That is the cure, the panacea for a life of worry. Life and meaning in life can never be found in hoarding or building up material possessions, because that's not real wealth in God's economy. Wealth, richness in God's economy is about the depth of our relationship with Him, the maturity of our spiritual relationship with our Father. You see, the beginning of worry as it comes into our life is the beginning of the corroding and the ending of our faith. As one increases, the other decreases. And the beginning of faith, therefore, the more we trust in God, can be, friends, the beginning of worry, anxiety, and fear in your life. And that's the sum of this, friends. You have a choice to face every day. You can go to bed and you can toss and turn, or you can go to bed and you can trust in God and turn over those things that you're worrying about to Him, and then live your life by seeking first the kingdom of God and not considering the things of this world as your primary motivation. I do hope you found that helpful. Welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast as we continue our journey together through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. Welcome today as we continue through the Gospel of Luke. The verses we're going to be covering today, picking up where we left off last time, verses 35 through 59. And the question I'm asking today is, are you ready? Now, you may respond to that be, ready for what? That seems fair enough. But what is it? Next week's party? Next year's vacation? Ready for what? Well, it seems to me that we're always in the process of getting ready for something, and Jesus told us that we need to get ready. But He didn't put it in the form of a question. He talked about that and put it in the form of a couple of parables, which in themselves told us how important it is to be ready. So let's find out together today what Jesus said, what we need to do, how we need to be in order to be ready, and ready for what. So let's find out together as we continue our journey through the Gospel of Luke. Welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, friends, hello again. Welcome. We've got quite a lengthy passage of scripture today, so rather than reading the whole thing in one go, I'm going to break it down into bite-sized chunks, into 4 or 5 sections, which I'll read, then work through it verse by verse, and then we'll try and pull the whole thing together at the end, as is what I usually do. So welcome, and let's pick up where we left off yesterday. The very next verse, Luke chapter 12, verses 35 to 40, and this is what we have. And it says, "Be dressed, ready for service, and keep your lamps burning, like servants waiting for their masters to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. Truly I tell you, he will dress himself to serve, and will have them recline at the table, and will come and wait on them. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if he comes in the middle of the night or towards daybreak. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him." Now, the key words, the key idea in this parable is the concept of waiting and watching. Well, is there a difference between those two things? If there is, what is that difference? Well, obviously you can wait, and how you wait can vary. You can just wait and be irritated, or you could wait and watch and be excited. Maybe the watching conveys an attitude of eager anticipation of the master coming back. So more than just doing that thing singly, the call here by Jesus is to do both together, watch and wait at the same time. At the age of about 15, me and my family moved to an area of the coast in Northern Ireland. We'd previously lived near Belfast, which is the capital city of the province, and we moved to a place called Bangor, which was an area called the Ards Peninsula. And it was a promontory of land which has several fishing towns and villages located all the way around the coastline. Places with great names like Groomsport, Donaghadee, Ballywalter, Ballyhalbert, Portavogie, Portaferry. Now, I knew quite a few fishermen who made their living on the little groups of trawlers, the little mini fleets of trawlers that worked that coastline, particularly those that worked a few that sailed out of the little village called Groomsport. Now, a conversation I had with a friend of mine illustrates the difference between waiting and watching. He began as an apprentice trawlerman, probably about the age of 17, and he tells the story about how his fellow older trawlermen, all of them married fishermen, used to view the catalogue of the various young girlfriends that he went through during his time of training with them. And they said that if he wanted to have a girlfriend who was a keeper, that he should have one that watched, not one that just waited. You see, the fishing boats at that time, in the mid-70s, they used to go out to sea for anything from 3 to sometimes 11 or more days. And after returning to shore, on their way back, they would message the local Coast Guard, usually when they were about 6 miles out, which was about 1 to 2 hours away, saying that they were coming in, and the wives and girlfriends would gather on the quayside. Now, as they neared the shore, the sailors would be gazing naturally towards the docks and see the little dots of people waiting at the end of the jetty. And this is where the loved ones gathered. And aboard the boat, the skipper would look through his binoculars and identify to some of the crew. And he'd say, I can see so-and-so's wife. And there's David's, there's Bill's. And then, oh, yeah, Tom, there's your wife. Now, our friend, he had a series of girlfriends, and when he came home, the one he was with at that time wasn't waiting by the dock. Instead, she would just wait in her house up the hill further above the village. And he would get ashore, go up to see her, and she would open the door and welcome him and give him a kiss and a hug and say, nice to see you back. I've been waiting for you. The advice for his fellow fishermen was, she's not a keeper. You should choose someone who watches for you, not just someone who waits for you. Anyway, back to the text. By the way, the Jews at this time divided this night, their night time of waiting and watching, into what were called 3 watches. The Romans actually had 4. But anyway, the Jewish watch, there was 3 during the night, and the second watch was from 9 in the evening to midnight, and the third watch was from midnight to 3. So what is happening here is declared as happening in the first watch. Well, what's the point here? The point is that if you're a wise servant, this parable is saying that you should not just be waiting, that you should be watching as well. You should be waiting and watching eagerly for the master's return. And when he comes, if you're doing this, then it declares he will honor you. So the wise servant, as described in this passage, gets bestowed with honor because he's been waiting and watching for the master. Now Jesus continues this narrative here, and in verse 39 he says, but now he's going to change the imagery that he's using a little bit, and he says, well, if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed the house to be broken into. In other words, he's saying, all right, you're waiting and you're watching, but you don't know at what point the master will come. And maybe you should consider it like a thief in the night. You should be ready for the unexpected. Which is where he picks up in the parable of verse 40. He expands us to say, be ready, for the Son of Man is coming, also at an hour you will not expect. Let me read it for you. Peter asked, Lord, are you telling the parable to us or to everyone? The Lord answered then, well, who then is the faithful servant and wise manager? The one whom the master put in charge of his servants to give them their food allowance at the proper time. It will be good for that servant who the master finds doing so when he returns. Truly I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose the servant says to himself, my master's taking a long time in coming, And then he begins to beat the other servants, both men and women, and to eat and drink and get drunk. The master of the servant will come on a day, and when he does not expect him, and at an hour that does not expect him, and when he was not aware of it, and he will cut him into pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. Now, it's worth mentioning, first of all, that Peter pops up immediately at the beginning of this section and says, Lord, are you talking to us, your disciples, or are you talking to everybody? And the Lord says in verse 42, Who then is the faithful and wise servant, who the Lord will make ruler of his household, to give them the portion of food in their season? Blessed is the servant whom his master will find watching and waiting on the day he comes. So the wise servant we saw in the first section was waiting and watching, and in the meantime he busied himself about the work of his master. He's doing what the master told him to do. He's actually working. Now, if we're in that category, and we've got a couple more that are coming as we've just revealed in the passages that follow, if you're in the wise category and you're doing that, you're watching, waiting, and working, serving in the world, serving God's people, then you're going to be honored when the master comes. But there's more. He says the master will make you ruler over his household. He will make you ruler over all that he has. So in a sense, there's going to be a sense of authority and blessing here, and you're going to be honored. You're going to be given a position of authority in the kingdom to come when the Lord comes back, but only if you're this first revealed wise servant in the first passage. And what is the wise servant like? He's someone who simply waits and watches, and while he's doing that, he works. All right, so that's the first servant. Therefore, be ready, it says, because the Son of Man is coming, and you don't know the hour at which to expect him. Then the Lord says, but if that servant, the servant who's been left behind, well, says my master's delayed in coming, so he's changing the focus here to a different type of service, how this servant responds to the call of God in their life. And he, instead of serving and working amongst the other servants, begins to beat up the other servants, and he begins to forget about those things and just eat and get drunk and be merry. The master of the servant, of course, will come one day, and he'll arrive at the time when this guy's not expecting it, when he's not aware of it, and it says he will cut him in two and appoint him with a portion with the unbelievers. Okay, very big contrast here. The first servant is the wise servant. The second servant in this passage is called, shall we say, and some do call him this in some of the titles given to sections in some Bible translations, he's called the wicked servant. So, who is the wicked servant? Well, he's defined that way based upon what he does. He is seen, rather than take stewardship and responsibility and care of other people, he abuses that position of power. He's a bit like the hireling shepherd described elsewhere by Jesus in another parable. This guy just abuses people and gets drunk. And it says what happens to him. Wow. He gets cut in pieces and appointed, and a portion appointed with the unbelievers. Now, please note that this guy is referred to as a servant. So at no point is he actually called an unbeliever. It seems he is a believer because of his description as a servant. In fact, if you look at verse 45, it says that he refers to the one he serves as my master. So he recognizes the master. As a matter of fact, he also not only recognizes, he also believes and knows that the master will one day come back. So here is a servant who believes the Lord, believes, if we were to extrapolate it out today's thinking, he's actually someone who believes even in the second coming. And for that basis, I believe that his starting point is clearly that of a believer. That's his description. So you say, well, how can you say that when, what he's doing here in this passage? Well, let's just look at what he does. He begins to abuse the male and female servants, and he begins to sort of spend his time eating, drinking, wasting it, in this case, getting drunk. Now, do you think this is to be taken literally, that he literally took out a whip and beat people up? He may very well have, but I think I'm also going to suggest that this is a little more figurative, particularly as it's revealed in the verses that follow. I think he's meant to stand for the picture of a servant who mistreats other servants by misleading them or taking advantage of his position. If you forgive me for saying that, I have seen that and heard of that among some pastors, some quite senior pastors who've mistreated other people who serve in the church or the church community that they have authority, shall we say, over. So not only is this a picture of someone mistreating other believers, but it's someone who's choosing very clearly, when you approach it from a parabolic point of view, that it's someone who's just choosing to live for himself, get what he can out of it. This guy's seen to eat and drink, even get drunk. And of course, the question that we to ask, is it possible that a believer can do such things? And sadly, the truth is, of course it's possible. All right. Then how do you explain what happens in verse 46? It says, the master will come on a day when he's not looking for him, in an hour when he's not aware, and he will cut him in two. What does that mean? What does that tell us? Well, by the way, the cutting in two, is it literal? Well, I don't think it is. Because if you actually read on in the passage, post this event, this intervention by God, he's still seen alive in the rest of the verse that follows. It says he's going to be cut in two, and then he's going to be appoint his portion. In other words, the ramification of what he's done, it's going to be appointed with the unbelievers. He's going to suffer the consequences in exactly the same way as unbelievers would in this life. The proof positive is the fact that he's appointed with the unbelievers. Now, the Greek word translated unbelievers here is sometimes, some Bible experts would say, is a bit of a mistranslation where it leads people to reach the wrong conclusion about this. It is actually translated in some of the older and better translations as he is appointed as being among the unfaithful, which I think gives us more of a nuance here. So if we back up on the passage where it says in verse 42, we're talking about a faithful servant, a wise servant who is a faithful servant. What we're talking about here, this guy who's defined as a foolish servant, is the fact that yes, he's a believer, but he's an unfaithful servant to the master. He's not faithfully living out the life that he should be. So I submit to you that this guy, this servant, albeit unfaithful servant, he is a believer, and what's happening to him and is going to happen to him is being described using figurative language. He's going to get his portion. He's going to have the consequences fall in this life, that's for sure. And that means that what he will experience in this life will effectively be no different than those who don't even believe. So in other words, he's not going to fare very well. All right, there's another type of person, which is revealed in verse 47, another type of servant. So it's the same scenario each time, but each time illustrating how people respond differently as servants to that scenario. So let's pick it up in verse 47. The servant who knows the master's will and does not get ready or does not do what the master wants will be beaten with many blows. But the one who does not know and does things deserving of punishment will be beaten with few blows. For everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. So he'll be beaten, and actually the term used is given many stripes. Perhaps this is just an extension of what the wicked servant is, but based on the fact that there seems to be two different punishments apportioned here, it suggests two different people. So I'm clearly suggesting that this third section refers to a third type of servant, a third type of way we can respond to the responsibility that we have in this world of serving God. And this guy I'm going to call the wayward servant, because in this guy in verse 47, again, he knows the master's will, but he's not prepared to do anything or to live in any way according to the master's will. He's not just like the unfaithful servant, he is in fact a disobedient servant who simply chooses to go his own way in life. So this number 3 guy gets beaten with many stripes, it says. What I believe is being talked and referred to here is specifically talking about this thing called the judgment seat of Christ, the place where believers are going to appear, And it's for him, because of the life he's lived. Yes, he's a believer, so he's going to be judged at the judgment seat of Christ for his life in this world. He's not going to face the great white throne judgment, but this is a guy who at some point was a believer and has lived a life that is wayward completely. And for him, well, how can I describe it? That meeting with the Lord is certainly not going to be a Sunday school picnic for him. I think it says that for him, what he's going to experience is sorrow and pain when he stands before the Lord at the judgment seat of Christ. You see, friends, there are many verses across the New Testament that say that even as believers, we're going to one day stand before the Lord and give an account of the Christian life we lived. And that there is going to be, based on how we lived that life, some sort of conscious awareness of reward or loss of reward awaiting us there. You can be honored and you can be elevated, or you can be in a position where you won't receive any of that commendation or receive any of the rewards that you could have received if you lived your life in a different way. So in this passage, there has been a wise servant, one who took the commission and who worked, a wicked servant who knew what to do and didn't do, and then this guy is pretty much a worthless servant who neither did nor cared about what he should do after he initially had come to know the Lord. So I want you to notice that there's a couple of things very important to pick up a bit. Number one, that there are degrees of punishment awaiting those who have lived or not lived their lives in terms of serving the Lord. And number two is there are also degrees of reward awaiting us, not only at the judgment seat of Christ, but in heaven itself. That's what this passage, I believe, is teaching. So it tells me that the afterlife is not just all about going to heaven and floating around in the crowd somewhere. There are some sort of system of rewards in heaven that are apportioned after we give our account, after we are called to give an account of the way we have chosen to live our lives. And the second thing I want you to notice is it's reminding us that to whom much is given, much is required. That was the statement in verse 48. For everyone to whom much is given, much is required. So within that, we have to accept that there is a degree of personal responsibility and accountability once we have been blessed with an insight that God has revealed himself to us and we've responded to it. So the basic point of this whole passage is that the Lord is coming. And the question is, are you ready? And then it unpacks for us, what will happen to us depends on what kind of servant we've been, how we've responded to the knowledge of who Jesus is. If you're a wise servant, well, you're going to watch, you're going to wait, and you're going to serve. But if you're this guy we've called the wicked servant, then God's revealed himself to you, but fundamentally you're still living for yourself. And by nature, instead of serving other people, you're mistreating other people. But if you're a wayward servant, you know you're not going to be ready. You're going to remain worthless in your life of service. You're not even going to bother to try and find out what God wants to do in your life. So the question that this parable arises in these three sections is not only are you ready, but what kind of servant are you? Are you the type of servant who's ready to face the Lord, one who's ready to stand before him and give account of your stewardship of all that he has given and revealed to you? So that's the first part, the main part of the passage. But there's more text we're covering today. Let me just read verses 49 to 53. Remember, this is Jesus speaking. I have come to bring fire on earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. But I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. Do you think I come to bring priests on earth? No, I tell you, division. From now on there will be 5 in one family divided against each other, 3 and 2, 2 against 3. There will be divided father against son and son against father, mother against daughter and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. You get the picture. The fire in the Bible is repeatedly used as an image and idea of judgment. So I'm suggesting to you that in the first part of the passage, we were told we need to be ready for the Lord to come back. But embedded in this teaching now, it is implied that when he comes back, we are going to have to give an account. And now he states, well, I have to say it like this: you need to be ready, because at this judgment, the thing you need to be ready for is division and fire. Now, everyone agrees that the baptism referred to in this passage, Jesus is referring to his own death, the fact that he's going to die on the cross. One way to tie all these verses together and with the previous section is to recognize that they fit around the outworking of the consequences of being ready or otherwise. So I think he's saying the thing that we ultimately need to be ready for, friends, here is this thing called the second coming. That's why he's discussing the different types of servants. I think he's saying, look, you need to understand that the thing you need to be ready for is judgment. Because at that judgment, of course, there's going to be a weighing and apportioning. So he's saying you need to be ready for that division of earthly souls to begin to apply. And you, based on whether you're a wise servant, a faithful servant, an unfaithful servant, or a wicked servant, that's the basis of how that division is going to bring. Now, overall, he's saying, I came to bring peace on earth. But he doesn't talk here about at this time, bringing universal peace. The first time Jesus comes, he brings the potential for personal peace with God. But the second time, he says, when he returns, he's going to bring peace on earth. So in the meantime, until all of this is established through the return of Christ and the setting up of the kingdom, he says, if you follow me, then that's the basis on which that division is going to be made between those who achieve that spiritual peace with God in this time and those who reject it, and ultimately those who will experience it eternally in the fullness of time when Christ returns. And then he lays it out for us in an example format. He talks about people being divided, and he personalizes that by making people realize that this will even apply within families, in the sense that even families are going to be split into groups. He specifically mentions the family relationships and how some will fall on one side of this judgment and some on the other. A judgment as in a weighing up of their life. Now, all of this, of course, sounds pretty heavy. But the point here is that the division is going to come, and it is even going to cut across families. So again, it's saying be ready for judgment, and be ready to be weighed up and judged and apportioned into which group of people you belong. So when we heard Peter ask at the very beginning the question, are you talking to everybody? Jesus makes it clear, yes, in terms of this, he's talking to absolutely everyone. He then closes this passage at this point, and it's confirmed that he's talking to everyone. It says, he said to the crowd, when you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately say to yourself, it's going to rain, and it does. And when the south wind blows, you say, it's going to be hot today, and it is. Hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? Why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? As you are going with your adversity to the magistrate, try hard to be reconciled on the way, or your adversity may drag you off to the judge, and the judge could turn you over to the officer, and the officer could throw you into prison. So I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. So Jesus here is addressing the wider crowd, and frankly, he's just calling them hypocrites. He points out their ability to read the signs, to predict the weather patterns, but questions why they choose not to discern the spiritual significance of what is playing out before him and the fact that the Messiah is coming. So in emphasis, he's emphasizing the need for spiritual awareness and readiness for everyone for God to appear in their life. Now, in tomorrow's study, we'll see Jesus challenge them further in this, questioning about their very inability to even judge the difference between what is right and wrong. And he advises them, when faced with a conflict or dispute, that they should make every effort to settle it amongst themselves before reaching the judge. So the call here is to settle these matters before we stand before the judgment seat of Christ, or before Christ returns and people are called to be divided as sheep and goats before the great white throne judgment of God. So the underlying theme here is to be prepared and to be ready, as I said at the beginning, in order to avoid these potentially unnecessary, severe consequences for you. And the passage concludes again with this call for readiness. Jesus urges his listeners now, this wider group of people, to settle their matters, to decide where they stand in these things in order they're prepared for that which is imminently coming. So the overarching message of this passage is clear. It's simply be ready, because the Lord's going to return, the judgment is coming, and any potential conflicts or disputes among you, you need to deal with them, and you must remain vigilant and discerning, and of course to be a faithful servant, proactive in the way you live your Christian life. So throughout Luke chapter 12, Jesus covers all of these aspects. He warned us against hypocrisy early on. Do you remember that? We covered it a few days ago. Covetousness, worry. The common thread is a call to be aware and be discerning of these things and to acknowledge them. And in order to do that and apply that in our lives, that is what truly makes us prepared. So the whole chapter 12, which we've been in for 3 days now, is meant to serve as a sort of cohesive unit with a central theme of being spiritually ready in the face of the challenges like covetousness, like greed, like worry, by overcoming those in order that we might be prepared for the life of service and any returning of the Lord. Clearly, these verses are simply calling us to live in the will of God, and the way we remain ready for his return, whenever it will be by doing the will of God. And that, of course, involves always being ready by watching, waiting, and working. And I'd like to suggest that in the context of the chapter, in order to be in that place of readiness, we also need to be aware of greed and worry and deal with it in the way he told us. So in other words, the best way to conquer the idea of any hypocrisy in our life, any greed in our life, any anxiety in our life, any worry for our life, is simply to be aware of the Lord's return and be busy doing his work until he returns. So are you ready? You know, there's a famous travel writer in the UK who wrote a lot in the 70s and 80s, a guy called Hunter Davis, and he once wrote of his travels to Switzerland, where one day by chance he became upon a beautiful villa and an estate situated on the shores of one of those beautiful Italian northern lakes. He spoke to the gardener, the caretaker, who was an elderly man who saw in the grounds, and he spoke to him for a while, and he found that guy had been serving there for over 30 years. And the guy said, yeah, he was very glad to show him round the gardens. So he asked how long it had been since the master visited, and he said, well, I've been here for over 35 years, and the master has visited 4 times. And our friend Mr. Davis asked him, when was the last time the master visited? And the man replied, 12 years ago. So Davis says, I see, so you always keep the gardens perfect in case the master returns tomorrow. No, said the man, I keep the garden perfect in case the master returns today. Thank you for joining me. I do hope you found that helpful. That's it for today. Another great day spent together studying the Word of God. I do hope you'll be back tomorrow and pick up where you left off. You can make sure you never miss another single episode by subscribing to this podcast wherever it is you get your podcasts from. It won't cost you a penny. You just make sure you'll never miss another single episode. You can also visit us at various places, the Bible Project at buzzsprout.com, and there you'll find a link to the new podcast which has just gone live, which is my History of the Christian Church podcast. I actually looked at some figures today. In the genres of podcasting in terms of popularity, Christian spirituality is number 49 in the list of top 100 genres. History is number 3. So, my way of looking to expand what I consider my ministry is to start a podcast in a history section, which, don't get me wrong, friends, it is going to be a thoroughly Christian approach to the history of the church, but I'm going to position it in a way that people who are interested in that sort of thing might stumble, if you like, upon what I shall present as evidence as the Holy Spirit working through the lives of 2,000 years of church history and in the lives of some of the greatest thinkers in church history. So if you're interested in taking that journey as well, there's going to be an episode roughly once a week till I can get it up and running. Hopefully there'll be enough interest in it that within a year or so it'll become self-sustaining financially, but that's the seed I'm investing in that for the first 2 years. And if you're interested, come along on that journey as well. You'll find a link there to the History of the Christian Church podcast, also going to be hosted at Buzzsprout. I do hope that's an exciting new thing for you as it is for me. But with that all said, I'll leave it there for today. Why not connect with me on social media, or better still, Patreon. You can become a patron, a supporter of this ministry, and that way you're able to reach out to me personally, and also you can financially support the mission of this ministry if you want. You don't have to, but you can still become a patron, and that way you'll have access to some of the bonus material that I make available over there. And the patron community are always the first to see what I'm doing and get to see behind the curtain a bit about all the other stuff I'm doing in preparation for my preaching commitments, and also the talking and the meetings that I'm involved in terms of philosophy, art, psychology, and lots of other areas where I try and find the intersection points between wholly unchristian worldviews and try and bring biblical perspective and a Christian worldview to challenge people where they are about what they believe. So thank you again for being part of this wonderful call that I've had at this stage of my life and enabling it to take place. And I do trust I'll see you back here again soon. Bye-bye for now.